Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for joining Sina and me today. Excited to have this conversation about this really important topic of trying to use AI to extract tacit knowledge, or we might call it tribal knowledge, or experience, whatever the term is, in order to try to help manufacturing firms. Because this is a big challenge that many companies are facing these days with retirements and changes in the workforce. So to start that conversation, I thought what would make sense is to just kind of quickly um, introduce ourselves. I've been in the manufacturing machine space for many years. I know that one of these real challenges that companies have is the retirement of experienced operators, the difficulties, the challenge of keeping technicians satisfied and comfortable when they're out on the road all the time with changing schedules, keep them from getting burnt out. And Sina Volkmann and the firm that she started in Germany, Findic or Find IQ, has some really interesting ideas. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm also interested, as Sina introduces herself in a minute, in hearing more about the German startup scene, because, in the US, we just kind of naturally understand the startup scene, technology startups. We kind of, even if we haven't been in one or done one ourselves, there's almost an instinctive understanding of what's involved, but it's, I think, a very different environment in Germany, which I think is more challenging and makes Sina's accomplishments and those of her team even more impressive. So let's start by having Sina introduce herself, tell us about that startup scene in Germany, and then we'll jump more into the conversation. Sina?
Okay, I'm ready. Thanks, Ed, for having me. So quickly introducing myself and maybe some background information on Find IQ. I just turned 30, so basically I'm in the age where people usually do different things in Germany than founding a company. Been working in the machinery industry in production for the last 8 years, roughly. And I was always focusing on, okay, how can we optimize? How can we digitize? How can we improve production processes? Came across different topics like condition monitoring, predictive maintenance, and we talked about this several times. I learned a lot about, okay, what works out and what doesn't work out when industry machines are, let's say, of different ages and have different complexity. And most of these technical solutions, they did not scale. And honestly, reason was like some edge cases of very, let's say, complex and interlinked machines, but also the organization, right? So usually if we bring a solution to life, it's always the most difficult part is to convince people and to get the product just to use it. So that has nothing to do with machines or with technology. It's really getting the acceptance. And when I noticed that database solutions did not scale because of technical and organizational restrictions, it was just like an idea that was born during COVID. We had that it might be useful to think about, is there something in these experts' heads we can use as a
Right.
database, right? And with the idea we had, there was also a concrete problem we needed to solve because if you look at the German machine suppliers, so let's call them small and medium-sized companies that supply machines, for example, to the US,
Hmm.
they could not send service technicians abroad due to, let's say, borders were closed, right? They were not allowed to travel.
Right.
And the downtime of machines, they went up, I guess, about 70%
Really?
in
7-0?
costs. Yeah,
Wow.
70. And the reason was there was supply chain issues, but there was also this one person that could not travel, the
Right.
expert. And it was like really impressive, like in a negative way, because I was like, I mean, we are talking about Industry 4.0, which is a German trend, right? So we came up with this idea to connect industry and production. Everything should be connected, I thought, right? So every failure should predict itself, every machine should repair itself. So why is it that big increase of downtime if it's just due to this one person? And then we try to figure out, okay, what is the structures in these experts had? How does an expert usually do troubleshooting compared to someone who is, let's say, younger or inexperienced, right? And then we came up with different AI models and we tried to make a solution out of it. But as you mentioned correctly, in founding a startup in Germany is, I guess, a bit harder than it is in the US. So you would usually not start anything potential that a problem would increase in the future, right? So there was a lot of time of figuring out what's the best way, getting first customers in, getting paid for the solution immediately, right? Because also, let's call it venture capital is less than it is in the US, right? So we were always used to have less money in the bank and being more effective in the solution we developed.
Right.
At the end, it was also some kind of success factor why we came up with this, I would say, very effective solution, because we did not have much time. There was COVID, we needed to solve a problem, and we don't have that much money. Now we have, but we didn't have that much liquidity or that much venture capital at the beginning, right? So you need
Yeah,
to be
you've had a successful
very
funding
on
round
point.
recently.
Yeah, the second one.
Oh, congratulations. That's
And
wonderful.
basically, thank you, thank you. And all the investors are still European based, but I'm looking forward to the next round with some US based investors. So that would be like next goal.
And what's your educational background? Are you a trained engineer?
Oh, no, obviously not. I'm the one you would never expect in the production, probably.
Okay.
Not because of my gender, but also because my background is just economics. So I've always been into numbers and to calculate the benefits out of these digitization products. So to give you an example, I had big projects with machine suppliers from Germany, and they wanted to establish or implement a digital solution. And before they could convince management, they would definitely calculate some kind of return on invest, right?
Sure.
So what money do we spend for a solution? What do we get back in downtime savings? And that was basically my part. And this
I
is
see.
also why I know some numbers and I know what works and what brings in value and what doesn't.
Yeah, that's an
And I'm
interesting
very
point because,
fascinated. Yeah,
well, I think that means that you created a solution and you're selling the solution based on the business value and the outcome, not because it's cool and fun technology. The people that have
yeah,
done it because it's a cool answer end up with that change management problem that you mentioned. So by coming at it from the business imperative, it seems like you may be overcoming that.
yeah, exactly. Some of them are asking us, okay, where's the AI? And I'm like, the AI is in the background, but the AI itself is not a solution or value proposition. And those that are really like in a problematic situation, for example, that they don't get people to build up a factory. I heard this several times with regards to the US. So they have the factory built, they have the machines shipped from Germany to the US, but they don't have the people.
Right.
So it's all about getting them into place as fast as possible and get them trained. And
And
then you
and
would need to be fast.
but it's
Yeah.
also, I mean, if they're in Saudi Arabia for the next month, then they can't be in the US.
Mhm.
Or if they've been traveling every weekend and every week and they've got senator status with Lufthansa because they're on the road so much, sometimes they need to be home with their family and, just take a breath and wash their underwear and calm down for a week. And it's really hard when you've got
Exactly.
these experts that are always busy around the world. So we got a
Mhm.
lot to talk about. Just quickly giving a little bit more background on myself. I've run businesses. I've been a partner with a German Mittelstand Maschinenbau in the US, so I understand the environment and many of the things that Sina is talking about. I normally work now in two areas. One, sales teams for middle market B2B companies, and then across the entire revenue growth process for middle market industrial manufacturers. I'm an independent director. I hold a number of certifications in that space. I've done a lot of global work in addition to being partners with a German company. I've started and ran a company in India, graduated Johns Hopkins, and I'm based in the Boston area. So that's a little bit about me. Now let's jump more into this conversation and hear more from Sina. And I think the place that I want to start is defining tacit knowledge or tribal knowledge.
Mhm.
Um, and maybe it helps to just kind of tell this old story. Many of you have probably heard it before, but you hear about this giant ship. The engine failed. The owner tried all kinds of things to find people that could fix it. No one could get it working. So finally, they found this old guy who had spent years fixing ships. They brought him in. He brought his, he came with his big tool bag, and then he wandered around, rubbed his chin for half an hour and thought about it. And he went up to this, pulled out his hammer, went up to this place in the engine, gave it a whack, and suddenly it started working. And everyone was happy until they got his bill. As the story is told, he billed him $50,000 for doing this. And they thought they had been ripped off. They said, "Why'd you charge us so much? I mean, you were only here for 15 minutes." He said, "Yeah, that's right. I mean, I charge you $50 to whack the engine, but there's $49,000 of experience that I've accumulated over the years that helped me know exactly where I needed to whack that engine in order to get it working." That is the essence of tacit knowledge. It's all those accumulated insights. In some industries, people, there's just touch and feel. They can smell the air, they can feel the humidity, they understand how that impacts things. So there's a lot of that experience. You've obviously got a lot more of a pragmatic perspective, Sina. So how would you change that definition of tacit knowledge?
Mm-hmm. I would maybe add just an information. So, what is not tacit knowledge? So, when we started, um, we did not have any, and that perfectly relates to that picture. So we did not have any machine data. So there was documentation that was outdated, unstructured, and everyone was trying to get the knowledge out of what was there. And for them, it was even, let's say, they could not imagine that there's something that is not written down. And that's basically the part that is called knowledge. So it's, for example, the interpretation and putting into a context or perspective what is there as an information. So I would usually explain that data is the fundament, right? Data could be, let's say, temperature, pressure, some single values, but you
Hmm.
don't know what exactly they mean. Is it okay that a machine or, let's say, a product is, the temperature is higher than it was before? Maybe it's fully okay, right? Because it is still in a range where you can produce.
Right.
But then there's information, and the information gives context to data because it explains you, okay, usually the temperature should be at this and that level, but in a certain situation, and for example, with a certain environment and the product you produce, it could be even higher or lower. So there is some kind of context.
Hmm.
But this one guy you were describing that puts information into another context, this is experience. So he
And
would know where this problem comes from and what to do.
And the amazing thing is that often those people that have that insight don't even realize that this knowledge that they have is
That is
special. It just feels natural to them. And they almost don't
exactly.
realize that everyone else doesn't have that same intuitive understanding. A funny example that I encountered several times importing machines from Germany had to do with the
Mm-hmm.
voltage supply. So many companies here are using 240 three phase, or maybe some kind of a variation of that. A lot of the machines we brought in were actually configured for 400-volt 5-wire, so three phase
Mm-hmm.
plus ground plus a neutral. And that was an unusual configuration for many of the commercial electricians and in-house maintenance teams in the places we'd sell it. And every once in a while, there'd be a problem where the machine would just act crazy.
Mm-hmm.
The behavior would be completely inexplicable. It would do crazy things, and we learned eventually to look for a wandering neutral, where for some reason something got loose, and that neutral just wasn't properly connected, and it was almost like a faulty ground in some ways in what the machine did. But we didn't have that context, so we could check the voltage supply, or we could check each of the legs coming out of it, and everything made sense. But that context that you talk about is so important. And suddenly, if you have that, and geez, this sounds like it might be that wandering neutral, then everyone's able to kind of figure it out and move ahead. But that context is critical.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, when we talk about training people, I would say that typically there's a couple of problems. So first, I mean, we have to learn up front. So you hire a new maintenance person, you hire a new service technician, and we've got this saying in American English, it's like drinking through a fire hose. In other words, the volume of
Mm-hmm.
information is so massive that and it's all theoretical. It's really hard to try to absorb it all. And much of it lacks that context that you talked about. We're just kind of feeding facts without the context. So a lot of it ends up forgotten. It's kind of a perishable skill. It fades over time. If we've got a maintenance technician in a factory with one or two machines, they may encounter something unusual just every 3 or 5 years. On the other hand, the machine builder and their service technician might see it once a quarter. So they tend to be much more knowledgeable, and they remember all these scenarios. There's also really no way to just pump all of that experience into somebody's head in, call it 2 week or 6 month or however long the training program is. Um, Talk a little bit, if you could, about your research and findings around training and how to get new technical service engineers and machine operators up to speed with a good body of knowledge, but an understanding of how to access additional knowledge.
Yeah. So usually you can, if we talk about knowledge management, you should divide between the knowledge management and the training that needs to be done upfront. So some kind of generic understanding of a specific machine or process. And then there is knowledge management in a way that that knowledge is provided to a specific situation in a specific, let's say, problem. Okay, you want to provide, for example, assistance if there's a breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
And these, let's say, different perspectives made us thinking about, okay, where do we want to position and what's the scenario in about 3 or 5 years if we don't have these people that would attend these trainings anymore, these on-site trainings, because they are not maybe interested or they don't have the time anymore and they don't even, let's say, benefit from it because they, as you mentioned, forget it afterwards. So we were
Right.
more into, okay, which knowledge needs to be provided immediately when there is a job that needs to be done, right? So that was always that we were thinking about, okay, what's the most effective way? And I would say that, let's say, give it a combined approach. So to definitely explain them how in general the process works,
Mm-hmm.
but combine this, let's say, fundamental or basic knowledge with some kind of ad hoc assistance where they get the knowledge provided in a, for example, step-by-step guidance, right? So what we experienced is that the let's say the worst thing you can do is just provide some kind of digitized documents or some kind of very complex and difficult to understand dictionary SharePoint structure where people would need to search.
Right.
Because if you have like technical situations or technical issues, they all use different terms, right? So usually they are talking about the same part, they're talking about the same process, but they use different words, and we're not talking about different languages.
Right. Right.
It's still German, it's still English. So just imagine someone in front of the machine tries to look up something and he uses the wrong keyword. He would definitely find like nothing. There will be no feedback, there will not be any valuable information. And this is what we try to overcome to, let's say, by transferring a knowledge base into a step-by-step guidance where someone just needs to answer some questions and will be directed to, for example, a probable root cause. So we would not, let's say, put the interpretation effort and these thinking and trying to find something to the operator,
Mm-hmm.
but make it part of the AI and the system.
So establishing baseline familiarity and then kind of on demand, very detailed, but contextually appropriate instructions that they get to by answering questions that you've created so that you eliminate the uncertainty of the way they might describe the problem.
Exactly.
Makes
And
sense.
that's very, I mean, it took us about 1.5 years to understand that, right? So there was a long research project before we founded Findig. As I said, it's nothing that you get up like somewhere in the nowhere of Germany and you have an idea of building some fancy product no one wants out there. Usually you would need to have some kind of validation phase.
Right.
So we were always thinking about, okay, what is the world like in 3 to 5 years? And what we expect, at least what we can see from Germany and also from the US-based customers we have, is the qualification, the quantity and the quality of people, it's just decreasing massively.
Right.
So we would expect someone that was a taxi driver before operating a machine in the future. You could not expect that he would be able to define the right words or understand how to ask questions or even to, let's say, set up a prompt to ask ChatGPT or any other generic AI solution if he's like completely from a different area.
Right. It makes sense. All right. There's another big challenge, and that is the fact that every day tacit knowledge or tribal knowledge is walking out the door for the last time. On the end user side, it's often because of retirements and reorganizations. On the vendor or machine builder side, technicians often get burned out. The travel is relentless. They don't want to do it anymore. They can't keep up with it anymore. It's a hard job for them when they're on site. Everyone is impatient and demanding and wondering why it's not fixed yet, and they're under a lot of pressure. They spend time in just different hotel rooms, disconnected from their friends and family, and often the reality that we don't talk about is that frequently machine manufacturers will ship machines before they're finished because they need to recognize revenue. And so a technician ends up somewhere around the world knowing that it's not done yet, and they can't say that, but they're going to have to figure out how to make it work. So they're under a lot of pressure. So that talent and all that tacit knowledge walks out the door. And meanwhile, the folks that are left behind find things that are breaking, and they don't know what to do about it. So we've talked about why it's necessary to have the knowledge, but how do you capture that knowledge? What's the process to actually extract it from people's minds and codify it into this database that you talk about?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I'm doing some kind of keynotes in Germany. So every week there's one or two to just explain what is tacit knowledge, what is AI, and how we can do knowledge management based on AI. And what people think is they really ask me like 3 times, but how do you get the knowledge out of these people's heads?
Right.
And I'm like, we don't use cables, right? So there's no technology, no AI that can read thoughts. We honestly just ask the people in the most structured way we could do it. So if you think of all these retiring people, and we have the same structure in Germany like we have in the US, so it's about the next 3 to 5 years that we lose a bunch of people. So it will be about 20 to 30%. They might even retire earlier because at least this is the way how it is in Germany. They are allowed to leave the company a bit earlier. They have had a hard working life. So mostly it's even less than 3 years, right? And companies start off asking the experts to write down everything they know, everything they experience. Just sit down, I don't know, take your 3 weeks before you go and write down everything. And what they don't do is they don't start from the end, but they should start from the end and ask themselves, okay, what exactly is the most important knowledge we should write down, we should capture?
Right.
Not everything, but the most important one. So what we do is, or what we did in the past, was just analyzing what is the crucial part of maintenance or operations service that needs to be written down and captured somehow. And that's the knowledge on troubleshooting. And there is some statistics that say that, especially for the US, there is a huge trend coming up the next years to find solutions for, let's say, knowledge-based troubleshooting. Yeah. And so what we do is we try to understand the structure, how an expert usually would find a problem and solve a problem. And we would do these workshops and interviews by bringing what the expert says into that structure. And honestly, we are a lot faster, a lot more accurate, and we get the very important information compared to an approach where you would try to get the knowledge out of any, let's say, systems, documentations, right? Because you would need the experts to review the data anyway. So
So
we
when
decided to really just go ask them, yeah, and get the knowledge right, let's say, from them if they are just in the offboarding phase, right before they retire usually. Yeah.
So it sounds like you've got a process, a structured process that you figured out for how to conduct those
Hmm.
interviews. Is that something
Exactly.
that you just have to train and model on a couple iterations for a company and then they do it themselves? Or do you find that it's such a barrier for most companies that your team actually has to go in and conduct those interviews all the way through?
Mhm. Yeah, so we have like the biggest companies of Germany as our in our customer base, okay? And I was expecting that it would be impossible to repeat this process because experts they will get tired.
Right.
An organization will get tired, right? So we don't get them for several hours. We just get them maybe for 30 minutes.
Hmm.
But we would need to integrate into the processes and the discussions that are going on anyway. So usually what we do is we start with the customer and we show them how to do these workshops or how to do these sessions.
Right.
And we explain them the structure. The structure is a very easy one. So what we do is basically we combine root causes with symptoms. So everyone who is in machine service knows that usually there's something you observe, and that's just linked to the root cause, and you would need to find the root cause.
Right.
So what we did was we set up a let's say two-dimensional structure, and that's so easy to understand that you could easily repeat it yourself. The only thing we would need to implement with these bigger customers that have, for example, production sites all over the world is some kind of knowledge manager. And actually, there's more and more companies, at least in Germany, that set up these resources. So they are called knowledge agents, knowledge managers, and it's a
Right.
very high position in these companies. Yeah, and they are just trained and they can do it themselves. I mean, we are not able to, I don't know, operate with production sites in Singapore and the US at the same time. We
Right.
are growing, but we don't have the people, and we want to enable our customers, and this is how it works. Usually, if it comes to a rollout, right?
So it sounds like two pieces. Number one, somebody has to own it, as we say in American English. There has to be somebody whose responsibility is to make sure this gets done, not just ask the maintenance manager to do it in their extra time. And number two, that they have to be willing to learn and follow your process because you figured out the way to make it effective.
Yeah, and it is the easiest way you can do it. There's the one way that is easier to not do it,
The
but
status
that's
quo.
usually something I don't recommend.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the competition is fascinating because with what you're selling, you have to
Hmm.
deal with the change management, but the competition is the status quo. It's not some other tool. It's the fact that everyone thinks they're too busy already. They are uncomfortable sitting down for an interview. They think they don't know that much. They don't know what they're going to say. All of those things interfere with it. It's the same for companies that want to create content for their marketing and sales. Many of the same challenges, I would imagine.
Exactly. Usually when I talk to companies and we start these onboarding sessions, um, I really remind them of the fact that their technicians or the operators, they were, let's say, educated to operate machines, not to document and to share knowledge. So we are now in an era, and we need to just understand that for those, let's say, countries, and it's not only Germany, it's not only the US, we have, let's give it, say it's the same structure, but there's a lot of other countries where there's fluctuations, where they don't get the people, and we would need to understand that this is something that is not like over, and it will, let's say, become as it was in the past again. It will completely change. There's a generational shift, there's a generational change of how machines are operated, and we just can't predict everything. We can't digitize everything. So that it's the only, let's say, few years of this, let's call it century,
Right.
we have to capture the most important, let's say, value we have, which is knowledge, which is experience, to be able to operate the same way in the future. And it's really only a few years of yeah that are left. And it's exactly, our competition is not any other AI solution out there, because they usually work with very generic AI models and they promise something, that they can do something and get something out of the data. The
Right.
competition we have is the daily business.
Exactly. And hope.
Yeah,
I mean, the alternative is to just hope or pretend like it's not going to be an issue. Um, who
exactly.
who sees this problem most significantly? Is it the companies that build machines,
Hmm.
or once they ship it, are they happy? And is it the companies that have to operate the machines in their production? Where do you think there's a greater sense of urgency?
Yeah, okay. So I guess you asked me the questions when we spoke the first time, and it changed over time.
Okay.
So usually you have like the machine suppliers in Germany, and this is the ones we started with, that want to, let's say, increase their service business, service productivity. So they don't have the technicians in the US, for example, but they need to operate the whole service business from Germany. So they don't provide any 24/7 support. They don't provide any documentation in several languages. So they had the pain initially when they wanted to, let's say, increase the resource or the availability.
Right.
But this is difficult to monetize or to understand, right? Because usually they just want to sell machines. At least
Right.
this is what they did in the past.
Right.
And then there was like a change going on, and I can't really understand. I don't really understand why. But the machine operators, so the production facilities all over the world, they notice that there's a lack of technicians out there. So usually, what took them about a day before now takes them 3 days until someone is there and repairs the machine.
Right.
And that's something that increases the downtime, not by, let's say, 20%, but maybe 200 or 300%. So those that run and operate machines are now the ones that suffer, especially from the dependency of an external service provider.
Right.
So what we see on an international level is the also some kind of establishment and market entry of independent service providers.
Hmm.
So usually those that have a few technicians, right? They yeah, in their portfolio, and they do service for different machines, different industries. So they don't mind because they don't own the machine, they just do the service.
Right.
And they also recognize that there's this gap. And what they do is they offer the people, and we could now enable these service providers, right? Because they have a central knowledge base where they can share the knowledge of different machines, and we enable them to do and to offer more of these service performance and activities. Still, if I need to recommend something to those that have production sites and have their own, let's say, maintenance team, I would become as independent as possible
Sure.
from external service or machine suppliers.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's a big miss by the manufacturers, the machine manufacturers, because
Mm-hmm.
it could be a recurring revenue opportunity for them. So increase satisfaction, differentiate themselves, make recurring revenue, and they all just have walked away from it. I shake my head. I don't understand why.
Yeah, but
Um,
why? That's exactly my question. Why?
I guess, but
Yeah.
but you don't need to figure that out. You figured out another way to solve the problem for the people that actually care about it. Um, that problem can be acute when there's a
Mm-hmm.
shutdown that now takes 3 days instead of one day, but it can also be gradual. One of the things that I've watched with machines over the years, there's a machine gets installed, there's a factory acceptance test or a site acceptance test. It runs really well. It
Mm-hmm.
meets the spec. It satisfies the parameters. Say it's running at 97 or 98% efficiency. But then over time, it gradually deteriorates. And it could be because it's not maintained properly. It could be because the environment changes. It could be because the trained operators now have moved to other things or left the company. Whatever the case is, that deterioration isn't necessarily observed because it happens gradually. And when they do realize it, suddenly they're not quite sure why. So, so what you're describing is a solution that helps the manufacturing facility that has a machine that may be gradually deteriorating to actually take the steps that are necessary to improve and maintain a high level of OEE. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, that's true. So it could be, I mean, you usually start with the most critical part of the production. So you choose, for example, some kind of machine where you don't have a redundancy,
Right.
and then you would immediately see that there is an improvement of the OEE. And this is usually sufficient to justify and invest in rolling out a system like ours, because if you do it for one machine, it's just like, say, the same way to cover a whole production. And also, machines are interlinked, right? So they communicate with each other, or if it comes to process industry, usually you would, for example, recognize a problem at the very end of the production line has been
Right.
caused at the very beginning.
Right.
And it's also something we focused on we try to, let's say, build up modules, but combine them to a full production line. And this would, again, um, bring OEE to a next level, because obviously the experts know where the problem comes from. But usually, if you are new in a production, you would assume that it's exactly where you notice the problem, that it has also been caused there, but it might be somewhere else in the production. And if you
Sure.
combine all these different modules, then you have, let's say, the lever is even bigger, because you have the whole line covered, and you would be able to understand, okay, the whole process.
So there's a lot of value, no matter who owns the responsibility or who decides they're going to take it on and own it, just trying to push down to the lowest level possible a high degree of solid technical information that's available to help people improve the operation. I think that's the bottom line theme of what you're doing, right?
Exactly. So if someone asks us who is our customer, I would always say something like, okay, the ones that recognize that service is done by those who own the knowledge. And there's these three different customer segments, which is machine suppliers that want to generate recurring revenue. And there is, let's say, 15 to 20% that are that innovative and see that it's also some kind of diversification of business models. It is the ones that operate the machines that feel they want to become independent. And there is the service providers that come more and more into the situation to offer, let's say, a full package or full service package. And if we address the market, for example, it's mostly the 20% that believe that there is something, for
Sure.
example, after a crisis, that there's a future and that they are relevant of the future. For example, because they are in an industry that is critical, energy, plastics, food. Those
Right.
are the ones that ignore that there is maybe economic difficulties, like we had the last year in Germany, right? Because um, their products are relevant now and they are relevant in the future. And those that believe that there is a future, and the ones that believe that they are part of it, they are the ones that invest now to prepare.
Makes sense. So you talked about the fact that you've got this very structured process for capturing information, and you've got this AI magic behind it. But tell us a little bit more about how you've actually, through your iterations and through your development, found that using the AI as opposed to just a traditional sort of a ladder logic algorithm helps to make this particularly effective.
So my co-founder, it's basically not me, but obviously there's always like a second or a third person. When you found a company, he's a data scientist for the past 10 years. We got to know each other in the research project I mentioned before. And honestly, I had many ideas in my mind of what to found a company with and what to bring into the market and become self-employed. But when I got to know him, I was like, okay, you would need to have some kind of problem that is growing and some kind of solution that just solves the problem, and not like coming from an existing technology, like for example the large language models, and try to find some use case out there. So we had the use case and I got to know him, and we had some kind of discussions with machine suppliers in Germany, and they were like, yeah, but we could combine like symptoms with root causes. And, this is usually how a technician copes with the problems out there. And he just listened. There was a conversation, there was another conversation. It was always, he was listening to those technicians. And after a while, I just remember the moment, because he was one I did not recognize before, because he was like more of the introverted ones, so more in the background. Then he came up and said, like, I think I have an idea. I was like, okay, show us the idea of how you can structure the knowledge. And it was a prototype. It was very not pretty at all. There was no front end. It was just the model in the background. And then we did some tests, and we did it for bakery machines first, and some kind of separation machines to separate oil from water, for example. So it was two different types of machines. And we set up the structure and we simulate some troubleshooting cases. So we just thought about any failure that could happen, and we just tried to get to the right root cause, and the result were correct. And the next result was correct. So what he did was he thought about different AI models that are used in different contexts, which have the same problem, taking decisions under uncertainty and incomplete information, because he was expecting something like people are people, and they might come up with knowledge that is not fully correct,
Right.
that is not complete, that does not work for every machine out there, because it might be different, and used different. So he was taking models from the military. I'm not quite sure if it was also from medicine. So like diagnosing some kind of diseases is just like similar to diagnosing a machine problem.
Sure. Right.
And he was combining different models. And the AI basically we use, or the different models we use, they are in a completely different area than these Gen AI solutions are, because they are based on a huge amount of very homogeneous data, and they try to get the structure out of the data. What we do is the structure is provided by us, and we just try to get the data and the knowledge that's needed, so we can assure that the results are at 80 or 90% accuracy immediately after we have set up the initial knowledge base. And there will not be any surprises of results, and not, let's say, the risk of maybe the system will just give a completely wrong result,
The
which sounds great,
hallucinations.
but it's just not true. Exactly.
Right.
And then there was this ChatGPT discussion going on. I mean, you are in the US, we're in Germany. There's a lot less capital that goes into AI developments, but all of our customers were like, oh, we can solve every problem with ChatGPT now, right? So if you have the technology, you feel that all of the problems out there can be solved with just one tool and one AI. And we were always telling those people, there's not only one AI. You need to understand which problem you want to solve, and then there might be different models you would need to combine. So we lost some customers last year because they felt that it's easier to take some documents and use some kind of large language model, or even the smaller ones, and get the information out of the documents. Most of them, they came back because they noticed that the results are sometimes not correct at all.
Wow.
And the documents is not the ones, or it's not the knowledge base or the database you would need, because in the moment when there is a failure going on, or with a product changes in the field, right, the knowledge base is outdated. So most of them, they came back because they maybe interpreted this knowledge management word or phenomenon differently. And yeah, we were just like telling those people that think about the problem you want to solve and think about how industry is like. And industry is different than, or machines are different than sitting in the office and trying to generate
Sure.
some marketing content,
Right.
right?
So because you're using a particular kind of AI, are you seeing
Mm-hmm.
the background capabilities of the AI advancing very quickly in your area, like we hear in the news in terms of Gen AI, or is it more stable?
Okay. Honestly, we are very surprised every month what's going on out there, and it's not driven by Europe. Obviously, it's driven by the US and Asia. So
Mhm.
usually we have some kind of stand-ups in our team to understand, okay, what's the new technology out there? Is it just like the next level of an existing technology? Um, if you think about, okay, the power you would need to have in place from a data science perspective, from an energy or capacity perspective, it's just that we would need to focus on very specific use cases where it's not the mass of data that differentiates us, or yeah, we would need, but it's the quality of the data and the understanding of the context. So what I experience is with these very industry specific solutions, the problems are the same like they were about 10 years ago,
Mm.
and there will be in the future, because it always has to do with knowledge for technical systems. So I don't experience that fast changes as you hear it from the news, honestly, because we are just lacking still the capability to implement such solutions, right? Even if
I
there
see.
is new technology being developed out there, it doesn't mean that the organizations are ready to implement AI at all. That's the thing I noticed, so that there should be a process in place, understanding the different AI technologies and also evaluating them, and then after some time, adopting them to the organization, but also preparing the organization, right?
But a large part of your value
Um,
proposition sounds like the fact that you relieve them of having to worry about any of that. You're basically bringing them a solution that works. If they do the interviews
exactly,
and put the information in,
exactly.
all the rest of it is irrelevant.
Yeah,
Are
and
are
also the amount of data we would need is a lot less than, for example, all these large language models would need. So it's very cost efficient. It's consuming less energy, less resources,
right,
and it's quite straightforward. So if we do it once for one machine and we can show that it's at an 80 or 90% accuracy, it's just the same for the next machines to come.
right.
So we don't promise that after, let's say, 1.5 years of experimenting and cleaning up the data, there might be the right result. We show that there is the right result immediately.
Hmm. Are you at liberty to share the names of any of the large clients that you're currently working with?
Sure. So what might be interesting is that one of our first customers was Siemens. I guess it was the fourth customer, because they have several corporations going on with the large companies like Microsoft. So they use Microsoft Copilot or other generic solutions to make data and documents available, but they want to share knowledge across several shifts and several production sites. So they were lacking these tested knowledge-based approach. And usually when we start with them, we do it in a very small scope, but 95% of our customers, they continue working with us, and they also decide for a global rollout. This happened with Phoenix Contact as well. So that's one of the hidden champions we have, but still a billion dollar company. So they are not that small,
Right,
for that you don't know the name. And they are also expanding to their global production sites. And there's also more and more US-based customers we have good relationships with. So we don't only work with, for example, Kulicke and Sofa, they're in the semiconductor industry. They use us internally, but they also, yeah, share the solution with their customers, because they are a machine supplier and they want to provide some kind of self-service solution to their customers. And obviously, if you talk about an industry like semiconductor, you are immediately in an international range of operations, right?
sure.
Because productions is obviously also in Asia and so on. So this happens faster as you can prepare.
So you mentioned a growing customer base in the US. You're actually,
Mhm.
so I've got on the screen your contact details for people that want to reach out to you, but you also have a visit to the U.S. coming up soon. Is there any flexibility in your schedule? Can you meet with other people, or is it all dedicated to the trade mission that you're on?
No, it's not. So I'm visiting an exhibition in Indiana at the beginning of April, and then I will be traveling from Boston to Pittsburgh, basically the East Coast, because we have some customers there. And my plan is to use the whole April and beginning of May to do some customer visits and to understand how production is like and how maybe also approaches are different. So definitely happy to schedule some meetings. We also have our first US-based employees that will join the trip. So
Wow.
yeah, maybe even a customer that come with me and yeah, get some better feeling of potential other use cases. So for sure.
Terrific. So that will be a great opportunity in just a few weeks. We're recording this on the 25th of February. So people should
Yeah.
definitely take your email address here and your phone number and get in touch. So let's shift to questions. Before I jump into the questions that we have, is there anything else that you want to add to wrap up your comments?
Start now. It's not getting better.
Makes sense. And you talked about how we've got this this narrow window. The technology has advanced to the point where it works, and all these people are walking out the door. So, I mean, you've given people warning. They get 3 years to get this figured out. So let's jump into questions. So let's see. Harry is wondering what the most number of technicians that you've worked with is. In other words, I think he's saying he senses that if you've got a team of 5 people, it's easy to sit them down and interview them. But if you've got this
Mhm.
team all over the world, how do you conduct the interviews? And I think you've touched on this, but he's asking a little bit more specifically. What's your answer to Harry?
Okay, so when we talk about the rollout, for example, with Siemens, it's not us anymore. So we would always recommend like having expert sessions of 2 or 3 people, not more, but having some kind of, let's say, knowledge agents or knowledge managers, as I mentioned before, and then just do these little rounds of, let's say, covering technology per technology. So usually, what happens is that we train 2 or 3 people and they do it for example, one production site, and then there
Got it.
will be the next one, and this he does it for the next production site. So that's what happens basically with Siemens, and I guess it's a several dozen technologies we have already covered, and I would say roughly the same amount of users that are already in. Just yeah, bringing in the knowledge and also using it afterwards for troubleshooting.
I understand. That kind of makes me think one of the challenges that I
Mhm.
often see is if you've got a company with multiple locations, they may harmonize the equipment, but they don't typically harmonize the efficiency. So people have a slightly
Mhm.
different way. They turn this knob to a certain speed, or they use a different pressure, or they have different settings that are their preference in each of the locations. Do you have any data on companies that have used this to actually harmonize the way they operate equipment across locations to improve efficiency?
Yeah. So usually to make it a bit, let's say, a simple way of starting and to scale as a solution as well, there's always similar technology. So even if a drilling machine is at a different age, it is a drilling machine. So you could easily take the same knowledge base and put it and copy paste it for another drilling machine, whether it's in Germany or it's in Poland or it's in Singapore, doesn't matter because the only thing you would need to change is the language
Right.
and maybe take some adaptations. So usually you could easily start with, for example, a headquarter or let's say a production site that is close to headquarter because they usually have the best know-how level and they are close to technology innovations going on, which sometimes is in Germany, and then they take it from here and they just identify another person in the US and they could immediately take the knowledge from Germany, translate it into English, and there you go. And that's how you usually do it. And the only thing we would need to adapt is the language.
Makes sense. You've talked about somebody having to own the process, having a knowledge manager.
Mhm.
Steve's asking a question that I think kind of ties in with that, but he's worried more about that initial piece. He's asking, is this something that you end up do you see typically having to pay people overtime, and how cumbersome is that first step, those first few interviews to prove the model? Is that a big barrier, or are companies excited enough that they all jump in to do that first piece normally?
So usually the first reaction is like, oh my gosh, I don't have 4 hours to bring in my most valuable experts to have a workshop.
Right.
I'm always telling them that if you compare it with several years of experience, they should have 4 hours time. Because if you don't spend 4 hours on capturing this knowledge, I guess that you just underestimate the problem. Usually, if we do a kickoff and we do it on site or remote, it doesn't matter. We combine some kind of expectations management. So who is Findic? Who is the customer? What do you expect after, for example, um, several months trial phase? We would just take these experts and immediately start discussing. What happens is that this first knowledge base is set up quite quickly. So they don't even notice that they are already in the discussion and that they already captured knowledge. And as soon as they understood that how the process goes and how the structure goes, there's usually one we identify who is very familiar to a structure, who is more the analytical and structured person, and they would or he would continue, yeah, with the same process. And for let's say there is objections, there's people that just don't want to share knowledge. There's people that are always under pressure, that don't have time at all. But after these workshops, usually it's been the best experience for both sides. So
Oh, that's
I
fascinating.
enjoy participating in these workshops. Everyone enjoys it because yeah, it's just like they have the chance to let's say share everything they know, and they get the structure, they get people that interview them. I mean, that's quite easy.
Right. How about security? I've got a question from Will, who's wondering, we hear a lot about you shouldn't put proprietary information into ChatGPT. And I know you're using a different
Yeah.
technology, but is there any concern about putting proprietary information into your tool that it might somehow be others might benefit from it where it learns on your information, for instance?
Yeah. So as we don't use any, let's say, open source or any generic solution, usually it's just about where the infrastructure is, so the servers are, or yeah, basically where the data is at the end and who the data owns.
Hmm.
And as we use proper or our own service, and as we are not interested in using the data for example, another customer, usually it's clearly separated, right?
Got it.
So it's the customer brings in the knowledge, the customer uses the knowledge. The AI is just, let's say, focused on the knowledge that is, yeah, for this specific customer. And at the end, if, for example, cooperation ends or if the customer wants back the data, we don't have ownership. So I mean, we are founded in Germany. Most
Right.
of our customers are very interested in data security. So this is basically, yeah, something that we learned very quickly,
Sure.
how to do that yeah, to make companies feel comfortable with putting the knowledge into our system.
And we've got one more question. It's from Ellen, and she's talking about vendors reselling. I think what she's driving at is white label. Do you have a white label model where others can provide your service under their brand?
Mhm. So we started to propose that machine suppliers can just replace our logo by their logo and their colors. So
Right.
this is how we started initially. And now we are even further than that. So we are proposing some kind of shared revenue model so that you change, for example, your logo, you resell it as a self-service solution for your customers.
Right.
And as most of the customers would not only be interested in bringing in, for example, just one machine and the knowledge base for one machine, we would even be able to open the platform and to share the revenue with the customer that has, for example, set up the initial contact, right, and set up the initial revenue. So this is something that seems to be a quite interesting business model.
So, in other words, if I'm understanding correctly, a machinery manufacturer would
Mhm.
white label it. They would put their information into it to help their customer with that remote access to troubleshooting and information. But then if their customer fell in love with it and wanted to extend that to all the other machines in their factory, the original machinery manufacturer would earn some revenue off of that expansion.
Exactly.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
And then
that
it's recurring revenue
yeah, sure,
model,
of
right?
course.
Mhm.
Well, that's all the questions. This has been a really a fascinating conversation, Sina. I really appreciate your taking time to join me. I'd ask people watching to make sure you capture the information there. Be sure to reach out to Sina, and by all means, if you've got questions about growing revenue or marketing or sales across industrial manufacturing, I'd be happy to chat with you as well. Anything to add as we wrap up, Sina?
Thank you, Ed. It was a pleasure talking to you.
It was great to chat with you as well. Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for joining
Thank
us for
you.
this conversation.